Hello, folks. You are listening to the Deal by Me podcast. This is where we ask guests to tell us your story. Your story can encourage, inspire, and hopefully transform a life. If you enjoy this podcast on YouTube, please leave us a comment and consider subscribing to our YouTube podcast channel. Today we have with us Lois Letchford, who tells of a very interesting story. She is inspirational and motivational, and she provides hope to many who face challenges. She is co-founder of Teaching Students with Dyslexia, writing and reading program. She is also an author. We are so happy to have her share with us today. Lois Letchford, it's good to have you with us today, and I'm excited having read your story and uh, learning a little bit about you. It's very intriguing and also very compelling, and so I'm excited and thrilled to have you join our podcast today. Would you share with us a little bit about yourself, where you've been interviewed from as we get going in our conversation today?
Thank you, James. Yes, I'm delighted to be here, and I am delighted to share my story because I feel it's an extraordinary story. As you hear, I'm not American. I live in upstate New York. I am Australian, but I married a man who became a professor. So we have managed to travel around the world. And at the moment, my husband is teaching at a place called Rensselaer Polytechnic. So we're in Troy, New York. And I followed him around the world. I have 3 sons. And even though my husband was a professor, my first son learns at the speed of light in past tense and present tense. The second one was the opposite and learns at the speed of a snail. And he didn't cope in school at all. And at the end of first grade, or in fact, the first day of school, he just sat in the classroom. And after day 6, I spoke to the teacher and she just threw up her hands and said, well, he's so far behind. I don't know how I'm going to teach him. And that was the start of a disastrous year. And the change in my life, because I'm then a mother with a child who does not fit normal. And how do you cope with that? And the consequences for children not reading with their peers is disastrous.
I hear you very, very well. I take it that you are teaching, and well, let me ask it this way. Are you still teaching now?
I tutor. Yes, I absolutely love it. And I love tutoring. Yes.
Okay. And you have a son who I take it was not doing well in school because he had some learning disabilities. Is that correct?
He had a significant learning disability. And the interesting part is that he had ear infections from the ages of 8 to 18 months. And I was not aware of the impact of hearing on the brain development and brain growth and learning. And unfortunately, when people see a child who struggles with speaking, we immediately put them in the too hard basket or low IQ basket. And we can't do anything. End of story. And we almost write them off at a very early age. And that is disastrous.
I got very interested in learning a little bit about you from your bio, and it's a very intriguing story because you talk about how you overcome the odds and how you provide inspiration and motivation and hope for others who face desperate situation. And obviously you were dealing with that with your son. So in light of that, can you just talk a little bit about what your son was going through in school or what have you?
That's a really tough question.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to tell you the end of the story.
Okay.
And I'm going to come back to it from now.
Okay.
My son went to school in 1994 and he failed.
Okay.
And at the end of 1994, we get him tested, and the testing reveals he can read 10 words, he's got no strength, and he has a low IQ. And now you've got this kid who's failed throughout grade 1. You've got a test that proves he can't learn, and you've got a low IQ. Okay. 3 continents later, Australia was our home. We had 6 months study leave in the UK, and then eventually we moved to the US. My son went from the bottom to the top through an extraordinary set of circumstances. In 2018, he graduated with his PhD in applied mathematics from Oxford University.
Wow. Well, I'm already made to be so amazing. You are just dynamic with what you have done and still doing. But what made you, I guess, so passionate about your teaching and working with your son to make certain that things were turned around? What was that pushed you to that limit?
First was that IQ test. It said he can't do it.
Okay.
The second was that we had this extraordinary set of circumstances that helped him, that changed him from non-reading to excited about reading. And the story I wanted to tell you happened after he graduated with his PhD. And I said to Nicholas, he's 30, confident, articulate. And I said to him, Nicholas, tell me what happened in first grade back in 1994. My son cried, and not a word escaped from his mouth. This is 20 plus years later. And that's when I recognized that trauma had happened in that first year of school, and there was an extraordinary set of circumstances that helped him move out of that basket. And then I said to him, I can't help you with that at the moment. But tell me what happened when you and I learned together in 1995. And my son's face went from that to this. And he said, I remember the poems you wrote for me. And he named the poems I wrote for me. And then he said, you taught me about mapping and changing the map of the world. And learning about mapping taught me to love learning. And he said, and I never want to stop learning. And the third thing he said was, you wrote a poem about a witch's spell. And I said, I did, Nicola. It was a silly poem. He said, and he's starting to laugh and giggle, like his 7-year-old self. And he said, that was just so funny. He said, I don't remember what the ingredients were, but it was just so funny. So this is what made me passionate. I mean, it happened a long time ago, but when my son is articulating what I did 20 plus years later about the transformation in his learning, I recognize that there's far more in learning than teaching letters and sounds. That teaching reading is an emotional connection. And it is about, yes, we do have to critically teach letters and sounds, but if all we're doing is putting letters and sounds in front of children and failing to say, how are you connecting? What are these letters doing to you? Is the child learning from? What else is the child learning? That's where I got passionate.
Wow. I can feel the passionate in your talk. I really can. And I assume your determination and grit. You talk about how you live to see the fruits of your labor and how you share with listeners the power of following, instincts and mindset and value of living in the moment. And I assume all that came from seeing your son achieve his PhD. Am I correct about that?
Well, it happened when we were in England in 1995, really, when he was 7, because
Okay.
that was the transformative year
All right.
that
Talk,
had, if
talk,
we,
talk about that a little bit then.
my husband, as I said, excuse me, I just got a bit of a runny nose. My husband is a professor and we had study leave in Oxford. And I started the same way as his first grade teacher with a set of books that's going to help him learn to read, and he couldn't do it. And I'm getting frustrated. My mother-in-law was with me and she said, Lois, put away what's not working and make learning fun. That became my first goal. And I thought, well, how do I do it? I write poems. So I wrote one and another and another. And every poem I wrote, he just loved. We are in a city that occupies some of the world's incredible artifacts. And we're visiting them as well as reading and writing about them. And while I'm teaching about these things, I'm learning that my son, who they said had a low IQ, has anything but a low IQ, that he could think. And I wrote this poem about Captain Cook because double O's come up. And while we're doing this simple poem, Nicholas said to me, can I see Captain Cook's original maps? And now for the first time, instead of seeing a child with a low IQ, I'm seeing a child who is thinking alike the best in the world. And that shift in my thinking was critical. Because when we see kids who are behind, all we see is they can't do letters and sounds. We don't see the thinking. We don't see what are they connecting. And I knew Nicholas has this brain that spins at 100 miles an hour, but the words come out at 1 mile per hour. And that 1 mile per hour, you think the kid is not smart. But when he asked a question like, can I see Captain Cook's original maps? I knew he wasn't slow. And then he asked, who came before Captain Cook?
Oh.
And I said, well, that's easy. You know, that's Christopher Columbus. And he said, and who came before Columbus? And now I'm blown away. So my goal when I'm teaching any child is to see beyond the struggle of letters and sounds. And I'm looking at what stops them from learning. What do I have to do to engage this child with literacy and learning so I take them from the bottom to the top?
Well, let me ask you this. When your son was 7 years old, did you ever imagine that he could or would achieve his PhD?
That's a brilliant question. You're right. No, I couldn't have imagined it. I knew he could think and I knew he was smart. But you know, if you read my book, you'll see the extraordinary set of circumstances that happened that took him from the bottom to the top. And without that extraordinary set of circumstances, it wouldn't have happened. So, and then it comes to me, why do we have to be exceptional? Why did we have to have this exceptional life to take this kid from the bottom to the top? And if children don't have parents who are supportive or parents who are working full time, the chances of the child getting out of that basket are few and far between. And that's what drives me too. So it's a combination of why all the time.
Wow.
And so much of our learning actually comes back to mindset, how we see that child. Do I see a kid who's capable of learning, or do I just see, well, he just can't do it?
Let me ask you this, Lois, because I'm a minister. I've just retired from pastoring 32 years from a traditional missionary Baptist church here in Durham County, North Carolina. And I started this podcast some months ago, and I did it for the purpose of actually continuing my ministry by hopefully interviewing guests who could share their experiences and events in their lives that could help someone else. So thinking about that and your story, how would you talk to parents, or what would you say to parents who are going through some issues with their kid in school, or who may have a child who is dyslexia? Uh, what would you say to them if he is seemingly not being he or she seemingly not being able to learn? What would you tell them?
The first is we can't change the child. We can't change one thing about the child. We can change the teaching.
Hmm.
What do we change? We change the teaching. That's
Okay.
the first.
Okay. We
And
change the teacher. How do you change? What do you do when you are changing the teaching?
every person in this world comes with a hidden backpack, their experiences, their language, their culture. Tap into the child, their culture, and their family. Make it culturally relevant. We teach reading. It comes from a standardized book, standardized text. Often white, often middle class, often female. If you want to alienate someone who's different, do that. We can change every single thing about the component of reading. And I ask the child if they know these words in front of us, and I use the child's words to help them say, I know this. So I'm tapping into the child's backpack, using their culture, using the poetry, using the oral language of their culture, building on that, writing stories down that the child knows, that the family know. That's number two. Is that number one? We can't change the child, we can change the teaching. How do we change the teaching? Make it culturally appropriate. Use the words and the language that the child is using. Number three, instead of seeing that child as a failure, see them as a future rocket scientists. See their strength. And I put children in front, or adults in front of them who look like the child, so that they know they are part of this group. I want an inclusive teaching. So I take my students, I use books. When I'm teaching Black boys, I make sure I have books with Black boys in them. And I talk about Richard Wright and Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. And I want my students to know these people have been there before you. That's how we engage them.
Wow. I'm so motivated by just listening to you. Listeners, don't go anyplace, because Lois is going to share much more with us. But first, I want to ask Lois, where can listeners get a copy of your book, or where can they learn more about you? Your story is very fascinating.
I have a website, and that's loisletchford.com. My book, Reverse to Memoir, is available on Amazon. There's an audio version, a Kindle version, and a paperback and hardback copy. Always connect with me at lois@loisletchford.com. I'm on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and I've had a few health issues this year, so I've been a little bit quieter. But I've taken off. I've been doing more teaching, private tutoring, and please feel free to ask me questions about your child and what you can do. There are multiple strategies that we can use for children who are struggling. There's not one way to teach reading.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with listeners. You seem very passionate. So I want to just ask you, what makes you so passionate about teaching?
First was my son's story was extreme, and no child should have to be in the 1% to learn to read. It should be, in this day and age, we should teach children within the classroom, and we're failing. That's the first thing that makes me passionate. The second was that teaching reading is so exciting. I call myself a literacy problem solver, because when a child fails to learn something, my question is, what do I have to do to teach this child to read? And that, to me, is exciting.
I love it. I truly love what you're saying. It says so much, and I know there are a lot of people listening, and who will be listening to this podcast, who may be going through some of these problems with their own kids. So hearing what you have to say, I'm certain I resonate with them quite a bit. So I think if I asked you, any advice you would have for parents whose children might be struggling in school, and if I've asked that, then just forgive it. But I think it's such a thing that I like to emphasize to parents who may be struggling.
When children struggle with literacy, and I'm teaching a little girl now at the moment, what she does with me blows me away. But she's 9, she's reading on a first grade reading level, lower. And I am just shocked that the parents are continuing to run on with a failing reading program. They're accepting that their child is not reading adequately instead of what else can we do?
Okay.
That's the first. Don't blame the child, blame the teaching. Look at the teaching. Second, I use a lot of oral language and a lot of poetry. Use poetry from your culture. Write it down for the child to read it, act it out, draw it out. Use the skills of all the family members to build on that oral language. Repeat it, find the rhyming words. That's a starting point. And then the third is what I just said before, is to show them people in their culture with whom they can identify, that allows them to say, I'm not alone.
Lois, do you have any suggestions for teachers who have children who might be behind in their readings? We have parents, but we also have teachers. Any suggestions to them?
This is a harder one because teachers often come with constraints.
Okay.
Are they constrained to teaching the words that are in the curriculum, or can they adapt it to meet the needs of the students in their classroom? And yes, you might not be able to change a lot, but you can bring in books where we have children relate. We forget that reading is a lot about making connections. So what books are you reading and using in your classroom that allow these children to make connections to the characters in literacy? That's huge. Turn those books from just a book, reading it, to a play. Engages every child in the classroom, and you start to see the strength in oral language, a brilliant memory of children who are struggling. And that's a critical component. So that's two things. Make sure it's culturally appropriate and turn the book into a play. Content is critical, but content, not just doing content for the sake of doing content that allows children to think. I've got to tell you a story. I'm teaching this little 8-year-old African-American boy. He'd come up from the city up to where we lived, and he was really struggling with all sorts of things. He was reading this white book, and it was obvious he had no clue what it was about. And I thought, let's just put it away. And I brought out one of my favorites, which is Richard Wright and the Library Card. Do you know that story?
No, I'm not sure if I'm aware of that story.
It's brilliant kids' book. It's quite old now, but it's still one of my favorites. And it's how Richard Wright, his mother taught him to read, and he learned. He was super. He was he sopped up knowledge, didn't he? And he could read at the speed of light with limited instruction. But he still had no access to libraries. Now, Richard Wright, I was guessing, was born 1910 off the top of my head.
Okay.
And he wanted to read, and he had to ask a white person to see if he could borrow his library card to get access to the library. And even doing that in 1930 was against the law. So I'm teaching this little boy, and this book is too hard. So I rewrote the book for him, very simple. And then I can start asking questions. Can you go to the library today? Yeah, I can go to the library. Well, when Richard Wright was a boy, he couldn't go to the library, and he had to borrow a library card. What was fascinating, and we talked about this, the next day he comes back to me and he said, my granddaddy knew about Richard Wright, and my mum knew about Richard Wright. And over time, then he starts to write, can we find Richard Wright's granddaughter? There's a level of thinking that goes alongside reading and writing that we ignore.
I hear you. I hear you. My wife is a retired teacher, so I'm going to actually talk to her about that book. 'Cause I'm just not familiar with it in such a long time. I may have heard about it, but I'm just excited. You write, and I just want to ask you a couple more questions. Well, is writing an easy task for you? And what is your dyslexic story?
What is my dialectic story?
Yes.
Okay, let's start to question one. Writing is a nightmare for me. I grew up dyslexic, undiagnosed. I grew up reading words I couldn't comprehend. It impacts me. It impacts the way I see reading, because everybody grew up reading Dick and Jane. White, middle class, American, I would even say. I grew up white. I didn't grow up middle class. I grew up on a farm. And I remember looking at these pictures of Dick and Jane with their coats on and their shoes and socks and their perfect clothes and their perfect hair and the father in a suit. And here we are in Southeast Queensland, Australia, which is subtropical. So for 9 months of the year, we are running around in as little as possible. One shirt, no shoes, hair that's wild, from a farm, animals that work, cats that are feral. And they're sitting here saying, these people do these things. And I remember looking at those books and totally confused, totally alienated by them. And then I listened to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Do you know her story? She's a Nigerian American author.
No, I'm listening to you with all of these different books and stories. It's kind of interesting to me. Some of them I've heard. I'm so old now. I've almost forgot everything I've read.
Yeah, well, she grew up in Nigeria. She'd be quite a lot younger than me, but she also grew up with Dick and Jane. Her parents were professors, and she learned to read with ease. But she's black in Nigeria and reading this white literature and reading about eating apples and drinking ginger beer. None of it happens like that in Nigeria. So she's, as a 4 and 5-year-old, she starts to write. What does she write about? She writes about eating apples and drinking ginger beer. She writes about exactly what she is reading about. Your personal experience is nullified. Nothing you do is as exotic as what they do in books. Her TED Talk is the danger of a single story. I identified with exactly what she said. Alienated, nothing I did, nothing in my life can be as good as what's happening in books. And it lowers you, it devalues you as a person. We need to get rid of that.
Well, Lois, I just want to ask you, can you sum up your teaching philosophy in a sentence?
Learning problems dwell in activities and cultural practices and not in the heads of individuals. It comes from Emeritus Professor Kurt Dudley Marling. So when children fail to learn to read, we are the ones who have to change, not them.
Well said. And there you have it, Lois Letchford, the co-founder of Teaching Students with Dyslexia Writing and Reading Programs. She has written a memoir. In this story, she details the journey of her son's dramatic failure in first grade. The story tells the twists and turns that promoted her passion and her son's dramatic academic turnaround. What a powerful story. Lois, thank you for sharing our podcast today. We have truly enjoyed you.